Isaias Ramos is the child of immigrants from Mexico. He's been in America since he was very young, and in 2012, Ramos was starting his senior year of high school in Memphis, Tennessee. He was captain of the Quiz Bowl team, he scored in the top 10% on a national college entrance exam, and things were shaping up for a bright future.
Like many children of Mexican immigrants, Isaias was in a position where his parents wanted him to do well and go far in school, but they didn't know how to help. They themselves did not go very far in school in Mexico. They had, because of poverty, dropped out of school early. His father had left school after the 6th grade, his mother after the 9th grade. And for them, the U.S. school system and college system was very, very different from what they're used to. And Isaias had to make decisions about it largely on his own with the help of people at school.
That's Daniel Connolly, a journalist and author of The Book of Isaias, a nonfiction account of Ramos's life. Connolly covered immigration for the Associated Press for years and says the trouble Ramos faced as a child of uneducated immigrants is not uncommon.
There were people at school, like the guidance office, who were encouraging him to not just apply to college, but to aim high, try to get into an elite school like Harvard. And at the same time, Isaias questioned the value of college. He didn't really see how it fit into his life. And so for that reason, there was this tension between his skepticism of college and the guidance office and everyone else recognizing how bright he was.
However, Ramos's college decision was complicated even further by the fact that his family had come to America illegally when he was very little.
In Tennessee, as in many other states, that creates a lot of obstacles in terms of paying in-state tuition and eligibility for state scholarships.
At this point, it may be easy to assume that Connolly wrote his book with the intention of defending illegal immigration. But Connolly says that's not true.
Honestly, there is a lot of harm created by the illegal immigration system. I'm not trying to justify what's been done. It has hurt not just immigrants, but American workers in fields like construction who are competing directly with people here illegally. So, when I talk about this, I think sometimes people imagine that I'm defending the system or defending the way things are. I'm trying to explain it and point toward the underlying causes of the situation.
Connolly says it's important for people to understand how illegal immigration became such a prevalent issue and who is to blame.
Our government historically chose not to enforce these laws. And the reason they did it was businesses wanted a low-cost labor force, and when the government moved to enforce the law in the interior of the country, these businesses pushed back and said, don't do it. A classic example I've brought up many times is in the Vidalia onion fields of Georgia in the late 1990s. The government started arresting Mexican immigrant workers who were here illegally. Other workers heard about it, they fled, and then all of a sudden the farmers didn't have a way to harvest their crop. The farmers, the big landowners, petitioned to the government, and they got the restrictions lifted, and the immigrant workers came back and harvested the crops. And that type of pressure from businesses has led to the situation where we have that, these people are here illegally. So to the criticism of just enforce the law, I try to make people understand that the immigrants themselves are not fully responsible for creating the illegal immigration system, number one. Number two, enforcement today, if applied broadly, can affect a lot of U.S. citizens because many of these folks have been here many years and they have kids who are U.S. citizens.
Connolly says it's telling the story of people like Isaias, innocent children who were brought to America very young, that motivates him to write about illegal immigration.
As human beings, we learn really well through stories. So I wanted this book to be a story about a family and about young people growing up in America. So it helps create empathy for the subject, for the people, and then also it helps you understand how we got here and where we're going. So there's this drama built into the narrative in the book of Isaiah that you've got someone with great potential and you don't know what's going to happen to him.
Connolly's book happens to be about illegal immigrants from Mexico, and while that is a familiar angle, it is not the only immigration story being lived right now. Author Shilpi Somaya Gowda is telling a completely different immigrant story in her fictional novel, The Golden Sun.
My stories have immigrant families at the core of the story because that comes from my own personal family experience as the child of Indian immigrants, and I've gone through my own smaller immigration path myself, moving from Canada to the United States, I think that there is such a common human experience that comes from picking up and leaving one place and trying to pursue a better life in a new country or even a new state or a new part of the country. And I do think fiction is one of those ways in which we can get to know people as individuals, almost as if you're getting to know a friend or a neighbor or a colleague. And by getting to know their particular story, I think it helps us understand the challenges that immigrants go through and the fact that we are all more similar than we are different.
What Gowda says she did try to do was give a voice to Indian heritage in American culture.
The history of storytelling is always affected by who is telling the history. And I think as different groups of people come into their own and have a voice, in my case, when I was growing up, I did not read one Indian author of my generation. And now there are dozens, if not hundreds. And so I think as I saw that personally as a young person growing up, I thought, oh, you mean my stories are stories that somebody would want to read, and they're not just about my, narrow little world. So I think that there is a rise of people having a greater voice and being able to tell their stories. That's how individuals learn from one another. We can't all have personal interactions with each other, but if we can learn about people through stories and to be able to have empathy and understand them.
Gowda says she used her novel to highlight one difference between the two societies she knew best that she found especially fascinating.
Often my father or my uncle or an elder cousin would have these disputes brought to them from somewhere in the extended family or the community, and whether it was a marital problem or, a parent-child issue or a business dealing that needed resolving, these things would get worked out over the kitchen table, by an elevated or respected member of the family. So I grew up watching all these lives being changed through this informal arbitration process, and that was something that I really wanted to write about because I think it's such a fascinating part of the culture, and it's another way of contrasting the culture of India in this case and the West. That the way we administer justice in the West is very much arm's length. I mean, we're not supposed to know any of the players. We don't work or live next to them when we go back to our normal lives. I think it's kind of interesting to look at the flip side of that. What happens if all these people have to go back to living together? They're not going to the parking lot and getting into their cars and going back to their individual lives. They have to farm next to each other and live next to each other. How does that change the way decisions are made and lives are changed?
Though she enjoys contrasting her cultures, Gowda says one of the most rewarding parts of what she does in the universality of the immigrant narrative.
It's always fun for me to hear from people whose parents came here to the United States from Italy or from Ireland or some place that is not necessarily in the news as being, a country from which people are immigrating today, but they have the same sort of experiences with their parents and grandparents, with the language and the food and, the cultural differences between the two places that they feel like they're from. So, I guess I do hope after the fact, after having written the story, that it will help people find some common experience with the idea of today's immigrants and some story in their own personal history.
And though their books are very different, one a nonfiction story of illegal immigration and the other a fiction story of legal immigration, both Gowda and Connolly believe in the power of telling the stories of outsiders to bridge the divide and encourage collaboration.
We've got a huge generation of children of immigrants growing up in the U.S. today, and as these young folks grow up and get into different fields, I think we're going to see just more and more of these stories in all media. The power of these stories is that this is what America is like today, and the entertainment and stories are a reflection of that. And I think that as time goes on, these stories will simply become part of the American narrative.
Daniel Connolly's The Book of Isaiah and Shilpi Somaya Gowda's novel The Golden Sun are both available now. For more information on all of our guests, visit our site, viewpointsonline.net. You can find an archive of past programs there and on iTunes and Stitcher. I'm Gary Price.